Hi, my name is Ed Stafford. This is the fourth episode of Anatolian Dispatch, a podcast affiliated with Aval News, your best source of information on everything that's going on in Turkey. Today, we're going to shift a little bit from our usual focus on U.S. perceptions of Turkey and try to get the perspective from another NATO ally. So let me introduce Dr. Chris Kilford of Canada. He holds a PhD in history from Queen's University with a focus on civilian-military relations in the developing world. He is a fellow with the Queen's Center for International Defense Policy, and he teaches an online course at the Canadian Forces College, which is focused on geopolitical issues. Chris retired from the Canadian Armed Forces after a 36-year career during which he commanded the 4th Air Defense Regiment and held other senior positions. As Colonel Chris Kilford at the Canadian Embassy in Ankara, Turkey, from July 2011 until July 2014. He served as Defense Attaché to Turkey with cross-accreditation to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkmenistan. So you can see that he's well qualified to speak on Turkey. Since his retirement in September 2014, he has become a recognized expert on Turkish foreign policy and Middle Eastern political issues. His book chapters, articles, and opinion pieces on Canadian defense and foreign policy issues, plus Turkish and Middle East matters, have appeared in numerous Canadian international publications. In addition, he has spoken internationally on Turkish and Middle Eastern foreign policy issues on many occasions and conducted numerous television and radio interviews covering similar subjects. He also has a book to his credit, which has to do with the Cold War in sub-Saharan Africa, but that's a little far from what we'll be discussing today. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Ed. I'm happy to be here. It's a great opportunity. To see you again. Definitely.
So because we're kind of pressed for time, we have such a full agenda, and that allows me to say that I hope that in the this will be the first of many interviews with you on Turkish affairs. If you could start with just kind of a brief overview of Canadian-Turkish relations, which is something we don't get. I mean, Canada is also an ally of Turkey within NATO, so go ahead.
Yeah, so here's the view from north of the border. And I would just add that my grandfather, my dad's dad, fought at Gallipoli with the Middlesex Regiment and lived to tell the tale, but so Turkey in our family was always front and center. But how about Canadian and Turkish relations? Well, I would say, generally speaking, they're pretty good. We have good trading relations. We do not have a free trade agreement with Turkey, but we have two-way trade of about 3.5 billion. And pre-COVID, you know, the common to see 150,000 or so Canadians visit Turkey every year. And most recently, at the NATO mission. The NATO training mission in Baghdad since November 18 to November 2020 was commanded by a Canadian general, and the number 2 was a Turkish general. So, you know, you see that kind of relationship there. So generally speaking, I would say that, you know, relations are good, but there are a few friction points. There are 3 that I picked out to chat about briefly this afternoon. First of all, it's the recognition of the Armenian genocide. And Canada was one of the first countries to recognize the Armenian genocide in 2004. And that created a friction point between the two governments. I mean, it didn't mean that trade stopped or relations stopped. It just created a little bit of a friction point. But since 2004, so many other governments, national governments or state governments have recognized the genocide that we're no longer out front on this, and so it's an issue, but a little less than it used to be. The other issue, of course, is we have an arms embargo against Turkey. We're not the only ones, of course, but after Operation Peace Spring in 2019, we introduced an arms embargo. There's quite a few caveats to it, but it did slow down the supply of arms to Turkey from Canada. Turkey is our sort of number 4th international market for arms sales. It's not a lot of money. It's probably $100 million Canadian, $120 million Canadian, but nevertheless, it's there. And it was expanded after Nagorno-Karabakh because the drones that were being used by the Azeris, supplied, we would think, by Turkey, had the Westcam targeting pods, which are made in Canada. And we extended the ban to include those. And the final friction point has been over the 2016 coup and Canada giving political asylum to the alleged followers of Fethullah Gulen. And we can talk about that a little later if you like, Ed, but that is a friction point that we do have with the Turkish government.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that. I think you're absolutely right about the Armenian genocide resolution. That having taken place in 2004, you're absolutely right. It's really been overcome by the number of countries that have done the same thing that Canada did, whether it's formally by the head of state or whether it is done by a parliamentary committee or something similar. For example, in the United States, we have had a resolution and put forward by a member of Congress regularly, but only recently, I think 2 years ago, was it finally approved, and that was simply because the White House was not really willing to use any of its clout to slow it down. Mm-hmm. So I think you're absolutely right. Although I think you're right also to call it a friction point, because even though other countries have gotten on board with that resolution, that doesn't mean that it has somehow become unimportant to the Turkish government.
No, and it's front and center on their website. So the foreign ministry website, the Turkish embassy website here in Ottawa, they mention it. It is still an issue, but much less. I don't think it really stands in the way of the bilateral relationship, perhaps like it would have in 2004, 2005, and so on.
Yeah, I also just wanted to mention briefly that it's kind of impressive that Canada, when it does arms embargoes, does them formally and officially. There is right now actually a de facto U.S. arms embargo against Turkey, because you have to understand the inner workings of the U.S. government a bit. Congress has to approve ultimately all the arms sales, and they can effectively stop any arms sales by dragging out the whole approval process, demanding more questions. I was actually, one of my postings was as working in arms control and arms sales and transfers. And if they don't want it to go through, and right now Congress, I don't think it's very friendly towards Turkey writ large. So, but formally, we haven't gone down the road that we went down following the 1974 invasion of Cyprus. But so let's move on to the political asylee issue and the Gulen and post 2016 coup.
Yeah, well, I've written about the coup. I was in Turkey up until the end of sort of 2014, but I was back there in 2016, just after the coup, in 2017, 2019. I mean, I follow it. And I always say, there's a lot of speculation about who was behind the coup, and lots of theories are put up. But I always say to people, at the end of the day, somebody did it. There's no escaping that fact. People climbed into fighter jets, they climbed into tanks, they rolled them down the streets, they killed 250 plus Turks, they injured thousands more along the way, and somebody had to be behind it. And we've heard the theories about false flag operations and whatnot. And I think if you could convince all of those Turkish military officers to get behind a false flag operation and spend the next hundreds of life sentences in jail, I mean, I can't imagine you could convince somebody to do that. And so in my view, it was a coup led by military personnel who were followers of Fethullah Gulen in the armed forces. And it was the culmination of a tremendous amount of infighting between the Gulen movement and the government that we saw building and building and building up to the attempted coup. Whether it was through the closures of the preparatory schools for universities or newspapers or whatnot, the corruption charges that came out in late 2013 against the government. All of the coup was the culmination of events. It was the last throw of the dice, if you like, to try to change things. And ultimately, as we know, it failed. And that, of course, led to followers of Fethullah Gulen being arrested and detained, probably in numbers that so many people were impacted that weren't involved, but nonetheless it happened, and many of them fled, and it impacted Canada as an example. So when you look at Canada, between 2017 and 2019. We granted 4,700 Turkish citizens political asylum. And of course, we're not the only country in the NATO world, in the Western European world, the North American world to do this. I mean, others have granted Turks political asylum as well. But Turkey, in that period that I've just spoken about, was our #1 country for folks being granted political asylum. And we fast-tracked them on the understanding that they were probably Gulenist sympathizers, supporters, whatever, but they were fast-tracked. Of course, that annoyed the Turkish government here because, of course, in their view, FETÖ is a terrorist organization, and here you have a NATO country granting political asylum to the followers of Fethullah Gulen. And through 2020 with COVID, of course, things slowed down, and I don't have all the stats, the latest stats. The best I could find that was in 2020, we granted 400 Turkish citizens political asylum with another 1,700 files outstanding still to be looked at. And so we have this additional friction point. And of course, as I said, we're not the only ones. But the Gulen movement, of course, is present in many, many countries, and Canada is no exception there at all.
Well, if you could expand a little bit on that. I mean, you and I have a mutual friend, a journalist, who spent some time in prison, incarcerated, on what I would consider highly spurious charges, completely specious. It made no sense whatsoever. Is your perception that of the military personnel who fled Turkey after the coup attempt, kind of were they all Gulenist supporters of the coup, or was it, what kind of mixed bag was it? Because I myself cannot believe that everybody who fled the government's response to the coup attempt was in fact a member of the coup plot. But I'd like your opinion on that, particularly on those officers who have come to Canada.
Yeah, it's hard to say. So you'll remember when I was in Turkey, I would go around to the embassies. I'd be invited to lecture on Turkish history, and I would take people through from the 1908 Young Turks revolution and through the Ataturk period in Menderes and so forth. And at that time, I used to say to people, what do Turkish military officers spend 95% of their time doing? And of course, nobody in the audience would know. They go, well, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, let me demonstrate. And I would do this. I'd look over my shoulder, because that typifies what it was like and still is, I would say, to be a Turkish military officer, always having to look over your shoulder. Right. And so when you look at the current situation, you're never sure, because it's not something that people want to actually advertise. I'm a Gulenist officer in the Turkish military. No one is going to come out and say that to you, because in the past, if they were supporting some other group, a Kemalist group or whatever group, whether it was the coup from below in 1960 or the failed coups in 62, 63, no one's going to come forward and say, I'm part of it. until it's all said and done, perhaps, or if it fails, you're going to run for the hills, and you're not going to declare one way or the other. So you never know. That's the short answer. I would say, though, for a lot of Turkish military officers who were outside of the country, for example, when this happened, they knew that if they went home, that they would probably be questioned and jailed and whatnot, because it was just simply a tough period. So there's a good chance that they're not, but they're just afraid to go home. And even if you look at the situation today, and even in the past month, 2 months, you're seeing, in some cases, a couple of hundred people arrested in one go, military personnel who were, we're talking, 4.5, well, yeah, at least 4.5 or so years after this coup, and they're still picking people up. Can you imagine what that's actually doing for the personnel that are currently serving? The fear, the tension that must permeate the ranks, it must be absolutely incredible. The only thing I would say then, based on my looking over the shoulder, is that it's probably nothing new. And Turkish military officers, despite all of the bravado that you'll see, have had to live through this for a very, very long time.
I want to pick up on that. Thanks very much for that. I want to pick up on the fear and the looking over their shoulder, that even though they've been doing it, since the coup and the government's response, rounding up hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, actually, many of them, of course, from the military who had participated in the coup, or maybe had, the wrong app on their phone or whatever, what's the impact that has had on Turkish military capabilities?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. On the surface, you might be inclined to say not much, because when you have looked at current operations, whether it's supporting the government of national accord in Libya, whether it's operations in Syria, cross-border ops in Iraq, of course, they're there anyway, but when they do mount larger operations, and of course, inside Turkey with the PKK, and now more recently with Azerbaijan, you're catching this now, right? It's a very long list. If you look at those operations, your tendency would be to say, hey, you seem to be doing okay. But I think you have to also understand that, as I know you do, but these are limited ops. They are limited ops. And quite often things don't go well. We've seen hostages killed and helicopters crash, and 36 soldiers killed in the Idlib pocket area. We've seen quite a number of things, and Turkey's generally operating fairly close to home for most of these operations. It doesn't require a large logistics trail. And I think also, I think it is a strain, because people are being arrested. You're never quite sure if your chief of staff is going to be there in the morning, as an example. And the fact is, the Turkish army is not that large. And we're conditioned now to picking up reports and newspaper articles talking about Turkey having the second largest armed forces in NATO. Well, yes, on paper perhaps, but look, they have, my best guess right now from 2018 figures, and I don't think they've changed. The professional force is about 156,000 personnel.
Mm-hmm.
The other 200,000 are conscripts. These are conscripts today that only serve for 6 months. It's the amount of service has been cut, from 2 years to 18 months to 12 to 6 months. They're practically useless as a source. So now you're dealing with a regular force of 156,000 personnel. And they are also having to do all of this, and we cannot forget, of course, that many are tied down because of the insurgency, the PKK issue. So I would imagine underneath it all, although no one will ever say or admit it, this would be a military that is quite, let's say, frazzled around the edges. Yeah.
On that, you mentioned that most of these ops have been small ops. They've been fairly minor, really, and they've been close to home. But there's also, so what's your perspective on their efforts in Libya, and also tied to that, which I think it is, the use of proxies, not using Turkish regular personnel, but using proxies to push this foreign policy agenda that they have?
Yeah, I think when I look at Libya, the fact of the matter is Turkey is supporting the UN recognized government there, and quite a number of other countries are not. So when you do look at it, you say, well, actually, they're doing the, technically, you might say, the right thing. But they have been using Syrian mercenaries, and there was discussion about this being the case in Azerbaijan. And I think if you're Turkish, it's actually quite a smart move, because I always wondered when Bashar al-Assad started to regain control of Syria, much of it with his Russian and Iranian and Hezbollah backers. I sort of wondered what was going to happen to all of these young men that the United States and Turkey had trained as part of the Syrian opposition. What were they going to do with them? Were they all going to sit on the Turkish side of the border and become a problem? You can't forget that when Syria was the home base of the PKK, Turkey was not happy with that. And now you'd find a case where Turkey was now doing what they didn't want to have happen to them. So you don't want to really be in this dilemma. So what do? The next thing you know, they're farming out all these young men as mercenaries. Quite a clever strategy. It will take the pressure off for a while, but at the end of the day, they're still probably going to be stuck with all of these young men who've had military training and they don't know what to do with them. But as a strategy, yeah, for sure. But it is a problem that has been created because of the Syrian civil war. When you have all these young men, and what do you do with them? So I wouldn't. I just think it's quite clever, and it also means that less Turkish soldiers have to be involved. But that doesn't mean to say that they're not there. They are obviously there, assisting. And by and large, I got to say, I mean, they've been I mean, if you're sitting in Ankara today, you've been quite happy with how things have happened, generally speaking. You've got good news out of Azerbaijan, and relatively, you stop General Haftar, you'd be happy with that. You've put your stamp of authority on parts of Syria, so generally you would be reasonably happy. But the fact is, behind the scenes, all of this is costing you a ton of money that you don't actually have. And there are more domestic pressing issues that should be front and center. And these conflicts are distracting Turkey from what's really important at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that assessment. A number of months ago, I actually wrote this piece for Aval News talking about the fact that all empires prefer to use mercenaries or proxies rather than their own. In other words, empires have tended to have one ethnic group that dominates, whether they were the German speakers of the Habsburg Empire or whether they were the Turkish leadership of the Ottoman Empire, or they were the English and Scottish leadership of the British imperial forces. But you would use locals, or you would use locals from one part of your empire and move them over to a different part, if you could, so that you would, have a nice, effective divide and rule. There's this ongoing discussion about whether President Erdogan is trying to reestablish some sort of neo-Ottoman expansive quasi-empire. What do you think about that? And is the use of mercenaries part of that, or is it just born out of necessity because better to send the mercenaries to die in the field of battle than your own Turkish sons?
Yeah, I've never felt that neo-Ottomanism was a grand strategy that Turkey put together. I think it's, as someone once said, it's events that drive things. And when I look at Turkey, if we can do an aside and go back and look at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and Yugoslavia also around that same time period, Turkey suddenly found itself being called upon to take a more active role in Central Asia, let's say, and in the Balkans and so forth. But at the same time, they were very constrained during that period in the 1990s. There were at least 11 governments, Turkish governments, some of them caretaker governments. There was Erbakan was removed in 1997. There was the big earthquake in Istanbul, and the Turkish economy collapsed in 2001. So I don't think, apart from some, Gulen schools setting up Central Asia, they were not prepared to take full advantage. So there wasn't any sort of neo-Ottomanistic policy at that point. It was just happening. And then when we move a little closer to the current time frame with the Arab Spring, again, it was events. Look what happened in the region. Right. Turkey didn't start the Arab Spring, but they've paid the price for it, if you like. Right. And that price has come as a result of Western countries, including Canada, taking a role in Libya, removing the government there, trying to remove Bashar al-Assad, and having Western countries, while they're busily involving themselves militarily, telling Turkey that they're a role model for the region as a Muslim democracy. So that might go to your head, I suppose. But Turkey now finds itself deeply embedded in the Middle East, but not because of, I think, any grand strategy. It's just sort of come about this way. And at the moment, it's trying to put back the pieces. Even if I look at it from a Canadian perspective, who thought that Canada would be leading the NATO mission in Iraq for 2 years, training the Iraqi armed forces, right, or bombing Libya in 2011? I mean, that was a Canadian general who commanded the NATO mission. Right. So who would have thought that? And all of us, right, Turkey included, are putting back what we can, the pieces. But at the end of the day, Canada is way over here, miles away. We've taken in 73,000 Syrian refugees, which is great, but I think we had a moral responsibility to do that. But if you're Turkey, of course, you're stuck. You're on
the border.
You've got 3.6 million Syrian refugees. You've got 400,000 Afghan refugees, many others. Every day, 500 Syrian children enter into the world in Turkey from, the moms and dads. So there's right, 500 children being born every day, yep, in Turkey. What a strain this must put on the country having to deal with this. So at the end of the day, a grand strategy for the region? No, I think they're trying to pick up the pieces like everybody else, and it's tougher on them because they are there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there may be sort of delusions of grandeur in one person's mind, but I don't think that there's any sort of elaborated strategy to get there. I have yet to observe any political leader who was not trying to take advantage of events to enhance his stature and his power and authority. And I think in many ways, what Erdogan has been doing over the last 12 years in particular is trying to cement his leadership and taking advantage from places where he could get advantage at a relatively low price. The arms embargo from Canada and the de facto arms embargo from the United States in response to Turkey's work in Azerbaijan, how costly is that? Which brings me to the one that's actually most costly in a sense, and that is the purchase of the S-400s. And that'll be kind of our last point, so we don't go too far over. Just quickly, how do you see those S-400s playing out as a part of Turkey's air defense system, an area with which you're quite familiar?
Yeah, well, for a large part of my career, I was an air defense officer, low-level air defense with the ADATS Gun Sky Guard, but I worked with Patriot systems in El Paso and whatnot. What to say about that system? Well, I think it's an unfortunate purchase. It came on the heels of Turkey shooting down the Russian jet fighter, the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Ankara.
Right.
It came on the heels of a difficult period where everything from Turkish tomatoes were banned from Russia, and tourism was used as a weapon against Turkey. So it came on the heels of a tough period with Russia. I think in some ways it was, designed to paper over some of the cracks in that relationship. They got stuck with a system that obviously no one in NATO wants to have on their doorstep. And now the question is, what do you actually, do with it? I don't think there's an easy solution to this. Lots of ideas have been bandied around, and I think it might come down to us pretending that they're not using it and us and just leaving it at that. You've got it, do what you want with it. We don't care. We'll say we do, but unfortunately, you spent 2.5 billion. You borrowed the money in the first place. You're stuck with it. You owe the Russians a lot of money, especially for things like nuclear reactors and stuff like that. So we'd be careful. We need to watch that relationship. But it's an unfortunate turn of events. At the end of the day, Turkey is the big loser here. Let's not forget that. They didn't need to buy that system, and they did it because papering over relations with Russia, a little bit upset perhaps with the United States for not offering Patriots with some technology transfer. We can't forget that the Chinese also thought they'd sold the Turks their S-300s before this. Turkey is the loser in this.
Yeah.
We have to remember that.
Yeah, I would agree.
How do we help them actually get out of the situation?
Well, and that's a good conversation for another session, because one of the political aspects over here in the United States is that there aren't a lot of people who are interested in helping Turkey to get out of the hole that it's dug itself into. And but that's U.S. Turkish relations, and I don't want to go there. I do want to talk another time. You may have heard that in the last couple of days that Jens Stoltenberg, the SecGen of NATO, has kind of ripped into Turkey about human rights policy and not adhering to the common values of NATO members and so forth and so on. But that's a larger question about, where do you see Turkey within NATO, given that, you were a serving officer for 36 years in a NATO defense force.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately,
should that be part two?
Yeah, unfortunately, we do try to keep these at 30 minutes because we're finding that kind of whets the appetite of those who would like to see more. And so you don't have to answer now, but I would really like to have another session in maybe a few weeks or a month, 3-4 weeks maybe, and gnaw on some of those other questions that we didn't have time to get to. We made no mention of F-35s, either from the Canadian or the Turkish perspective, and then there's also this it is a large issue of NATO of shared values, common values, and where that is going to go, and obviously there's so much more.
And I have a very long answer for that, Ed, which we can save for round 2.
Excellent. So I'll take that as a commitment to a second round. Okay. So Chris, I want to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure seeing you. And to all of our listeners and those watching, please stay tuned to Anatolian Dispatch. You will find it educational, as I do all the time when we have these great guests. And just keep reading Aval News. Thanks very much and take care. Bye-bye. Bye, Chris.
Goodbye.